so much for joining me. And let's jump in. If you would just give me just a brief introduction to yourself and what has led you to this point in your career.
Yeah, Christine, thanks for having me on. Appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts on peace building and the business and private sector's role in that today. So my name is Luke Lindberg. I'm the president and CEO of South Dakota Trade, which is our state's de facto international trade office. We are a public-private partnership, so we get some funding from the state, but we have a um, large number of businesses that are active in our membership and help support our organization and really help position our state for success in the global stage. So that's the role that I play in day to day, my job today. But previous to this, I served as the Chief of Staff and Chief Strategy Officer at the Export Import Bank of the United States. For those of you that aren't aware of EXIM, it's a small independent government agency that has a big checkbook that helps American companies export their goods and services all around the world. $135 billion lending authority from Congress to do exactly that, take goods made here in America and make sure that they have the financing they need. It doesn't compete with the private sector, but it definitely is there as a agency of last resort that when your company is looking to sell your products, we had the chance to step in and help finance some of those opportunities and make sure that we can compete against all different kinds of nations all around the world. So I served in that capacity during the Trump administration, and since then I've moved back to my home state here of South Dakota, where I serve on the South Dakota District Export Council. I served in that capacity prior to my time at the Export Import Bank as well, and happily am also serving today as part of the board of directors for the National Association of District Export Councils, which represents small and medium exporters all across the country. We have a close partnership with the CIBER schools, as well as many other organizations out there that are engaged in helping sell American goods and services all around the world. And so, in that capacity, I get to serve as the co chair of the policy committee, which enables us to put together a cohesive trade agenda to support those small and medium exporters and make sure that we have the agreements and things we need in place to be successful. And again, have a really robust trade agenda both in Washington and at the state capitals all around the country. So I'm honored to serve in that role. I feel really blessed to be able to work with just hardworking Americans who have small family-owned businesses and farmers and ranchers and folks that are doing the hard work every day to produce the goods we consume here domestically, but then also export overseas.
Super, super. Um, so the topic of business and peace, um, it's a big one, and obviously there's a lot going on in the world right now. Um,
Yes.
so what do you see as the role of business and peace?
So I go around and give talks quite a bit these days. Get the fortune of speaking to audiences frequently, and I often ask the question as part of my remarks when I'm in front of groups is who here thinks that the world is safer today than it was 3 or 5 years ago? And oftentimes there are zero hands that go up in the audience. So many people know and understand that it's kind of a mean, nasty world out there right now. There's a lot of conflict happening, and conflict is not good for international trade. And so, from the seat that I fill, which is how do we build strong, resilient economies here in America, in our state levels and things, and in our small communities and rural communities, we know we need to have good, strong networks of foreign buyers. That builds resiliency into our company's ability to sell products. And so, what I always say is, conflict is bad for trade, peace is good for trade. We don't have supply lines getting shut down. We don't have shipping routes being shut down when there's peace and there's stability in the world. And so, for the average folks here in South Dakota, it may not always make that connection between how their product may end up in one of those foreign markets. But the reality is for example, 60% of our soybeans which is our state's largest export, end up in foreign markets. And so to me, there's a fundamental building block to the prosperity we have here and ensuring that there's peace around the world and enabling those partnerships and building those relationships to be successful. So, from a peace perspective, I think we all have a role to play. I think we all have equities in that discussion. And I think the private sector is no different, right? I believe that at the end of the day, private sector companies have a fiduciary responsibility to seek profit and produce value for their investors. And part of that is enabling the markets they need to be successful so that they can then actually do business in those markets and yield those results they're looking to bring back and add that value back to the shareholders.
Awesome. So how do you, when you're talking, especially with a small business, um, I mean, obviously you gave a great answer, but how do you really help them understand the importance of looking outside of the state of, just say, South Dakota, or even if they're saying, oh, well, I might export to North Dakota, maybe Montana,
Sure.
I'm going to go really far and go to Iowa. How do you
Yeah,
help them understand?
no, it's a great question. I think everybody intuitively knows that a business that has one buyer is a significant risk for that buyer having a bad year, that buyer having a bad quarter, and that, for a small business directly impacts their bottom line. So you really don't want to have a sales cycle that revolves around one big client or two big clients if you can avoid it. And I think most people understand that and conceptually get the fact that having a diversified set of places to sell your product, in fact, actually builds resiliency and prosperity into your business for the long haul. A lot of these small and medium exporters and companies and things, they're not slaves to the sort of quarterly profit cycle reportings and earnings calls that these public companies are. And so they understand they're planning for the future. They're planning for their kids and their grandkids to have the same business and be successful and continue the growth pattern. And so they are looking for ways to make their business stronger. And so a lot of times we talk about is we don't need you don't maybe want to export to 10 different markets. Maybe for you it's two or three different markets in two or three different states. And that is a sufficient amount of diversification that then helps your company again weather some of the natural cycles of the United States economy, but also the global economy. And so it's really talking to them about some of those key fundamentals. I was just visiting yesterday a company here in South Dakota that produces great family business. They actually were awarded the 2024 Small Business Administration's Family Owned Business of the Year here in South Dakota. They make large signs, and they're not a particularly active export company, partially because it costs a lot of money to ship large signs to foreign markets, and we live pretty far from most borders. But they have done some work in Canada, and they're considering some work in Mexico and other places. And again, just adding a little bit of that diversification, I think in the long run helps them. And who knows where those markets will end up, but helps them to be able to, if one of their domestic clients, has a bad year, to really be able to continue to realize some of those profits and again kind of bring home a well structured, diversified sales pipeline that will continue on to the fourth generation because they're currently on their third generation of ownership right now.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. Um, what about um, helping small businesses or helping businesses in general understand that obviously strong business is important here in the United States, but even potentially in export markets where there is more conflict or the potential for conflict, that exporting to those areas and helping increase business and the economies in developing economies, say, can be helpful for those areas.
So the U.S. I think has already made a decision in the way in which we engage in world affairs, and oftentimes our decision results in us being very generous to the rest of the world. Right? We have organizations, agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development that provides aid to war-torn, conflict-ridden, challenging economies around the world to help prop them up, build them forward, help them advance, grow their domestic local economy. Millennium Challenge Corporation is a great example of that as well. It's a small agency that does big work in Africa and many other parts of the world where we tie some of our aid dollars directly to them deciding to do the right thing, whether that's increasing voting access or supporting different aspects of their domestic economy. We begin to tie some of our aid dollars into those particular outcomes we're seeking, and I think that helps part of our peace journey around the world. And that's a decision again the U.S. has made. Well, I believe that part of those aid dollars and part of the work we're doing in some of those countries should be tied to them using made in America products and services. So if we're the ones gifting those dollars to these local economies, if we're the ones making those generous contributions, they should be buying American products then alongside those to help implement those different opportunities. And so I think there's a number of companies out there, and I've experienced this in my time at the Export Import Bank, where these companies will come alongside some of these aid dollars and actually find that they can help build that port, or they can provide consulting services on how to help support that local economy, or they can sell some kind of a EPC contracting opportunity or an engineering plan as part of those aid dollars, which again helps drive business back to the United States and use those monies to support our domestic economy here. So I think that's kind of one way where I'd like to see us continue to pursue a foreign affairs agenda that aligns our domestic interests with the interests we already have overseas in helping promote peace and prosperity in those local geographies. But then again, if you look at it from a supply chain perspective, a place like the Democratic Republic of Congo, America needs more critical minerals. We have a huge reliance and dependence on those in everything from cell phones to F-15s, F-16 fighter jets, right? So for us, we know we need these, and the DRC, as an example, is one place that has been a challenging neighborhood to operate in, but yet they have resources and things that help drive our economy. And so we need to be engaged in those areas so that we then can work with them to make sure that they understand the value we provide. We can help them grow and become better and improve their own lives. But at the same time, we can then also work to bring some of those resources in to power our own economy. And so it really is, from my perspective, a sort of holistic approach to making their lives better, which in turn, again, builds our prosperity and domestic longevity and sort of economy here at home.
Okay, awesome. I like it. Um, hmm. So you just talked about the DRC. Any other areas that you think would be especially important to consider?
I think so. We have at South Dakota Trade, we have a steering committee that we work with. It's comprised of industry leaders from a variety of industries across South Dakota. And annually, that group comes together and talks about three things. What are our priority export markets? What are our priority export products? And what are some of our pain points? And so I'll go back to that group, which is really advising me on what are the markets and opportunity zones out there where we can be successful. And I think if you look at it, East Asia, we used to just say Southeast Asia, but I think East Asia as a whole is really, growing dramatically, right? Places like Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, even India, obviously, is the most populous country in the world at this point. All of those markets are seeing incredible increases in their GDP per capita. And that's where people start to move from subsistence into having some buying power, where products that we make here in the United States that are not always the cheapest, but they may be the highest quality, really can start to flourish in those markets. And that's everything from the proteins, the animal proteins, beef and pork and things that we make here in South Dakota, that people start to buy not just rice and things, but they start to then, as soon as their incomes rise, they start to buy more proteins. That's a very common occurrence. To widgets and all kinds of other things where they start to see they want and have a more of a demand and an ability to buy some of these products that again are sort of higher value proposition items, which is where America tends to be have a comparative advantage. We're innovators, right? We are sort of have the cutting edge stuff here, and so I think that's where we start to see some success. And so I'm excited about that sort of Southeast and East Asia marketplace and theater. And I think we need to be engaged in there really in the midterm in particular, largely because I think the next sort of 3 to 10 years is going to be a really boom time for their population growth and their economic and per capita GDP growth. If you look past that, Africa is what everybody's talking about, and so at that point, by 2050, the estimation is that 25% of the world's population will live on the African continent, and about a third of the world's working age individuals will live on the African continent. And so we as a state, and I think as America as a whole, need to be thinking about how does a demographic shift like that impact us? How do we build relationships there today that help, we sow the seeds today, and use a farm analogy that produces the crop down the road. And so we just had a delegation in South Africa a couple of weeks ago. We're looking at other opportunities. We took the South Dakota soybean group, took a group to Morocco almost 2 years ago now. So we're continuing to build opportunities to go into Africa in the eventuality that we get to where we need to get to. I was in Kenya last year with a delegation from the United States, and we saw some of the merits of some of our trade policies and how we're investing in Kenya. I think Ambassador Meg Whitman is doing a great job. She calls it the Silicon Savannah in Kenya, and really providing local workers with the opportunity to produce goods and services that are valued here in America. We saw a clothing manufacturing company. They had a line out the door every day of 2,000 to 3,000 people hoping to get jobs at a facility that already employed 3,000 people. And they're producing clothing, 8% of which they said ends up in America. And so we're investing there to produce those good jobs. And then in hopes that down the road, we'll have more of a reciprocal trade opportunity as their incomes start to rise as well. We'll be able to ship more over there. And it's really a longer term investment into what I think will be a very strategic marketplace down the road.
Okay, great. You mentioned, and I'm going to change course a little bit, but you mentioned trade agreements, and we've seen a bit of a pullback on some trade agreements, and there does seem to be some misunderstanding about trade agreements. What would you say to companies when they say, "Oh, trade agreements are bad for my business"?
I think there has broadly been to your point, a shift in the understanding of how not only trade agreements, but really the U.S. trade policy agenda regime impacts American companies and the jobs and workers we have here. And I think for too long, we pursued a free trade agenda that really was unrestricted free trade, right? And it was into a place where we sold ourselves out in many of our agreements and didn't hold our counterparties accountable to the agreements that we had in place, to the arrangements that were part of that. And I think we saw the fruits of that come to reality, where we have these large trade deficits with a number of countries, China being the most obvious example of which is to me problematic in the long run. It's okay to have a trade deficit with a country on a short-term basis, right? There's going to be ebbs and flows in those relationships, but the idea that we're going to give up complete access to our market and not gain some kind of reciprocal access to their market and be able to actually execute on that, I do think hurts our companies and our workers domestically. But if you look at the data, particularly on the farming side, free trade agreements have had a huge boon, have been a huge boon for American farmers for a long time. The reality is we produce more crops and more proteins and more, derivatives of those than we could possibly consume. And so we need to be exporting those because as we increase the innovation in agriculture, it really does allow us to continue to push our products and sell to those markets where they demand what we can produce, and we're producing more and more of it on less and less acres. And so it's a great thing, and those trade agreements set the groundwork and allow us to do that successfully. So I think we're seeing a course correct. I think we still need to go out and pursue trade agreements. I mean, if you look at the US Mexico Canada agreement, I think it's a terrific sort of case study, right? Bipartisan support in the Senate for its passage. Since its enactment, we've seen Canada and Mexico take over as the US's largest trading partners, surpassing China. So we're doing more business with Mexico and Canada today. And it sets a timeline and a framework where we can reevaluate, is this really helping the American economy the way we anticipated it would down the road? And so I think there is a modernization, is the way I would call it, of trade agreements and the way we look at these. But the reality is we still need to be out there, and we still need to be engaged, and we still need to be finding market access for our companies, because it does make a difference, right? It does enable, and there is data to show. Look at even the phase one trade agreement that was signed, that originally when the tariffs came on, we had a drop, for example, in exports of a number of products, right? When they initially, President Trump announced the tariffs. If you look at the signature after the phase one trade agreement, for example, our ag exports are up 40% higher than where they were before that phase one trade agreement took place. And so I think if we're negotiating from a position of strength and we're holding the other country accountable to what they actually agreed to, trade agreements are a great thing and can actually be very beneficial for our companies. It's just a matter of doing it the right way and making sure that we are negotiating from a position of strength. I think is where the key differentiation has needed to come back around. And I think we will see that data continue to come back in as we pursue it with that type of path. Unfortunately, right now, the trade agenda in DC is kind of, like you said, sort of faltered. It's at a standstill right now. We really haven't pursued any new agreements. China is actively negotiating 8 new trade agreements right now. And so that's not the place we need to be at. We need to be negotiating, again, from that position of strength, but active as well in the process, and not just letting the chips lay as they fall today.
Tell us more about South Dakota. I mean, I admit I'm from Indiana, so I'm in no position to talk about South Dakota. But I don't know a lot about South Dakota. So what are the biggest exports?
Yeah, we export about $7 billion a year. Accounts for about 10% of our state's economy. About 1 in 12 jobs are directly supported by exports here in South Dakota. And agriculture is king. So of that 7 billion, about 5 of that billion is in ag, and then the other 2 is in everything else. We largely export soybeans and corn are our 2 top exports, and then pork and beef and wheat are the next 3, depending on the year where they round out to be. We have a pretty interesting financial services sector here. Many people are not aware of this, but in the 1980s, there was a significant deregulation in South Dakota around the banking industry. So oftentimes, if you process your credit card, you'll see it was processed in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And so we have like Citibank and Wells Fargo and a number of other large financial institutions that have their American headquarters here in the state. And that has spun off into additional support for the trust industry. So we have very active trust administration. We actually have the most trust assets of any state in the country. So people all around the world now are establishing trusts in South Dakota, and we have administration companies that run and manage those trusts for folks. So we're heavily engaged in that space. We've got a great manufacturing sector. I'll highlight our governor's support, particularly for the defense and arms sector of manufacturing. We've been recruiting new like firearms manufacturers, for example. We've got some drone companies here, some body armor companies and things that have established great operations and good support. We have some large heavy equipment manufacturers here as well. Think about rock crushers and stuff like that for mining projects and other things. We've got a few folks in that space, and so it's I think it's well diversified. In some of those areas, we've also seen a fair amount of tourism, which most folks don't always qualify as an export, but we have Mount Rushmore and the Badlands. So tourism is either our second or third largest industry in the state, depending on the year, and it really provides a tremendous opportunity for us to showcase America, but also our state to those foreign tourists that want to come in. So we spend quite a bit of time working with our tourism department on making sure we showcase South Dakota well and take advantage of those incoming dollars when people come visit us.
Super. Um, let's talk just specifically about peace building and what advice would you give to companies?
I think, from a peace building perspective, I think it's really each company has to figure out what role they want to play in these efforts. I just think about stories more than I think about broad overall principles for this. I think about, on October 7th of last year when Hamas attacked, Israel, and there was people over in Israel that I've done business with in the past, and me reaching out to them and expressing condolences and checking in on them and those kinds of things. I really think like a lot of these peace building efforts are like that. They are relationships we've built over time that help various regions weather the storm of whatever is happening day to day. So I think there's an element of just sort of the personal side of business that when you're doing business in these markets, oftentimes people want to do business with people they know, with people they like, and that helps to I think weather some of these challenging moments. So I think that's part of it. But then I think about things like during COVID, where you have FedEx, for example, right, donating their planes and shipping medical products to various places around the world, right? In COVID, there was unrest and people were concerned and understandably, confused about what was happening. And in those times, in those moments where there's pressure and stress, we have a tendency to see increased amount of activity that, is conflict. And so as your company, what assets and what resources do you have to uniquely support that region, that opportunity? You don't have to boil the ocean, right? So I remember being a part of a group that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was working on in the aftermath of COVID. I was working for a large healthcare company at the time, and they were trying to figure out how to support India and the surge in cases in India during COVID. And we had a SWAT team coming together, and it was like, man, Indonesia is really bad right now. Well, nope, we're going to come back and focus in. We really have an opportunity to impact India. We have the resources on the ground. We've got the right partners. We've got to keep our eyes on the prize here and focus in. And so there's a natural tendency to launch big programs that you feel, may globally impact a lot of, but that's a really hard concept to wrap your head around for most companies. But if you have a meaningful presence in a country or meaningful relationships, it's focusing in on where you can actually make a difference and not trying to do that boil the ocean strategy.
I like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, that would be a couple of ideas that I think companies can consider.
Okay, super. I want to be mindful of your time, and I had promised you about 30 minutes, and so we're just at the 30-minute
Sure.
mark. Anything that we haven't talked about that you want to make sure you mention?
I think it's a very confusing. I always say the in particular the U.S. trade agencies and federal government structure is confusing for a lot of folks that are out trying to do good, trying to export their products, trying to figure out how to do it safely and effectively, get paid, when you ship your products overseas and things. that plays into the peace building aspect too. Maybe they want to make a difference. Maybe they want to work in a market that's challenging or provide services. And so if you can kind of get a sense of what those agencies are that are working in that space, it's the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, it's the Development Finance Corporation, it's the Millennium Challenge Corporation, it's USAID, Agency for International Development, it's the Export Import Bank of the United States. Even the Treasury Department has resources that are on the ground training countries on how to manage their books the best way possible, or think about financial or monetary policy. Helping yourself get educated on those tools, although it's a wide array and I know it's confusing at times, can really help you position yourself for making an impact in this space. You can increase your exports as part of that. I think that's an important aspect that companies, again, want to add to their bottom line. But there are tools out there that I think are fairly effective that can help you do both peace building activities as well as adding profit to your bottom line and doing so effectively. And it's just a matter of really understanding what role each of those plays and how you might come alongside them to de-risk the proposition of getting into a new market or working in one of these more conflict areas and help make sure you're protected on the back end of that. So hopefully, if you don't have connection with your state trade agency, I'm sure my counterparts around the country can help you navigate some of those. So feel free to call whoever is working at that level in your state.
All right, super. Well, thank you so, so much for all of your thoughts and insights. I think this is going to be really interesting to the readers.
Thank you, Christine. I appreciate the chance to do this.